You are standing in a burning library and the men feeding the fire are not criminals. They are officials. They are smiling. And that single image, that quiet, bureaucratic smile in front of collapsing knowledge, is the most terrifying thing human civilization has ever produced, because it has repeated itself with almost mechanical consistency across every century, every empire, every religion, every ideology that has ever reached for total power. This is not a story about the past. This is a story about right now. About what you were never supposed to find out. About why certain questions make certain powerful people extremely uncomfortable. And it begins not with fire, but with a decision. A very quiet, very deliberate decision about what the next generation is allowed to remember. Most people believe history is simply what happened. It is not. History is a selection. It is a curatorial act performed by people who had something to protect. Every textbook you ever read was written by someone. Every documentary was funded by someone. Every museum exhibit was approved by someone. And that someone, always, without exception, had interests, had borders to defend, had a story about themselves that needed to remain intact. The dangerous question is not what happened. The dangerous question is, who decided what we would be told about what happened, and more importantly, what did they leave out? Because the answer to that question does not lead you to dusty archives and forgotten footnotes. It leads you directly to the present, to the world you are living in right now, to why certain things feel wrong but you cannot explain why, to why you have this persistent, low-frequency feeling that the version of reality you were handed does not quite fit. The Library of Alexandria is the name everyone knows. The comfortable story is that it burned in an accident, in the chaos of Julius Caesar's campaign in 48 BC, and that was a tragedy, certainly, but an accident. The uncomfortable story, the one that takes considerably more courage to sit with, is that it did not die in a single night. It was dismantled, systematically, over centuries, by multiple successive powers who each understood, with perfect clarity, that a library containing alternative cosmologies, competing philosophies and medical knowledge that contradicted official doctrine was not a cultural treasure. It was a threat. Bishop Theophilus ordered the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 AD, not in ignorance but in full understanding of what he was doing. He was not burning paper. He was burning the possibility of a different world. And here is the detail that history courses never linger on. It worked. We do not know what was in those scrolls. We will never know. The silence left behind is total, and that silence was the point. But Alexandria is almost too famous now. It has become a safe tragedy, something we mourn from a distance, something that happened to other people in another time. The erasure that should unsettle you more is the one that was so complete, so architecturally thorough, that the people it was done to cannot even argue against the version of themselves that was constructed in their absence. Carthage. When Rome finished with Carthage in 146 BC, they did not simply defeat a rival. They deleted a civilization's right to speak for itself, permanently. Every Carthaginian literary work, every legal text, every philosophical or religious manuscript, destroyed. What we know about Carthage we know almost entirely from Romans, the people who had every political reason in the world to describe Carthage in the most unflattering possible terms. The child sacrifice accusations, described in vivid Roman and Greek texts, cannot be verified from a Carthaginian source because no Carthaginian source survived. They cannot defend themselves. They cannot clarify. They cannot say, "This is not who we were." Their silence was engineered by their destroyers, and that engineered silence has lasted over 2,000 years. Think about the implication of that. An entire people rendered permanently mute, and then described exclusively by the people who murdered them. The Maya of Mesoamerica represent perhaps the most quantifiably catastrophic single act of deliberate intellectual destruction in recorded history. When Bishop Diego de Landa held his auto de fe in the Yucatan in July of 1562, he burned every Maya codex he could find. Books on astronomy that documented celestial cycles with an accuracy that would not be matched by European science for another century. Books on medicine, on legal tradition, on the complete cosmological understanding of a civilization that had been intellectually sophisticated for over 1,000 years. He burned them because he called them the work of the devil. He documented his own act. He wrote about the Maya weeping as their books were destroyed. That detail is in his own account, which means he saw their grief and continued anyway. Of all the Maya books estimated to have existed, 4 survive. For the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, the Grolier Codex, 4 fragments of a complete intellectual world. And here is the dimension of this that most people never consider. We cannot know what we lost because we lost it. The very nature of the destruction means we cannot inventory the absence. We are standing in a room where everything has been removed and we cannot even remember what the furniture looked like. What the Spanish did with fire, the British did with curriculum. And this is where the machinery of erasure becomes truly sophisticated, truly modern, truly relevant to the world you inhabit right now, because it requires no flames at all. When the British formalized colonial education in India across the 18th and 19th centuries, they did not burn Indian libraries in the way De Landa burned Maya codices. They did something more durable. They created a school system that taught Indian children that their civilization had been essentially pre-rational, stagnant, requiring European governance to develop. They taught this consistently, in English, to the children of the Indian administrative class, the people who would go on to govern, to write, to teach the next generation. Within 2 generations, significant numbers of educated Indians had internalized a version of Indian history written entirely from a colonial perspective. What that curriculum did not teach, what it was structurally designed not to teach, was that India had accounted for approximately 25% of global GDP in the early 18th century. That Indian textile manufacturing had been among the most sophisticated in the world before British trade policy deliberately dismantled it to protect Lancashire mills. That the legal and financial systems the British East India Company exploited to establish its foothold had been built by the civilizations it was in the process of subordinating. The destruction was not of documents. It was of the habit of consulting certain documents. It was of which questions felt worth asking. It was the most elegant form of erasure, one that required the erased to participate in their own erasure, and to call that participation education. The uncomfortable pivot, the one that turns this from a historical survey into something genuinely unsettling, is the moment you begin to see the same machinery running in the present. In 1992, Serb nationalist forces shelled the National and University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo with incendiary rounds. Not accidentally. Specifically, the library contained the largest collection of Ottoman-era manuscripts in the Balkans, centuries of Bosnian Muslim cultural identity in written form. Librarians and civilians ran into the burning building to rescue what they could while it was shelled. They formed human chains in the street while embers fell on them. Approximately 2 million books and manuscripts were destroyed. This was not 146 BC. This was 32 years ago. The same logic: erase the cultural memory, destabilize the identity, make the people easier to redefine, executed with modern artillery in a city that had hosted the Winter Olympics 8 years earlier. In 2015, ISIS filmed themselves destroying the Mosul Museum, smashing 3,000-year-old Assyrian artifacts with sledgehammers and posting the footage deliberately as a message. The message was not, "We are powerful." The message was, "Your history does not exist unless we permit it." That is the same message Rome sent to Carthage. That is the same message De Landa sent to the Maya. The technology changes. The logic is identical. And then there is the erasure that has no footage, produces no dramatic images, generates no international outcry, because it looks like policy. Like funding decisions. Like which research gets published and which does not. Like which stories about ancient Egypt appear in museum exhibits and which ones require a specialist to find in a journal that nobody reads. The evidence that ancient Egypt, the civilization that produced the pyramids, that preserved and extended mathematical and astronomical knowledge that shaped everything that followed, was deeply rooted in sub-Saharan African culture is not absent. The physical evidence from mummies, the physiognomy visible in ancient sculpture, The explicit descriptions written by ancient Greek historians who actually visited Egypt and described its people as dark-skinned, this evidence exists. Ancient Greek writers called Egyptians dark-skinned in terms that were completely unambiguous to contemporary readers. This was not contested in antiquity. It became contested in the 18th and 19th centuries, when European scholars had specific ideological reasons to contest it, because acknowledging it would require European civilization to confront the fact that its own intellectual lineage, the philosophy and geometry and medicine it traced back to Greece, had itself drawn heavily from a civilization it had racially categorized as inferior. The erasure here required no fire. It required funding. It required academic consensus. It required generations of curricula that simply did not ask certain questions loudly enough for students to hear them. Here is what all of this converges on: the realization that should change how you read everything you read after this moment. The act of erasure is always a confession. Every burned library tells you something was there. Every suppressed text implies a truth powerful enough to frighten the people suppressing it. Every civilization rendered mute by its destroyers was muted precisely because it knew something, said something, represented something that the destroyers could not afford to coexist with. The silence is shaped like what it replaced. And if you learn to read silences, if you learn to ask not just what does history say, but what is history conspicuously not saying, and who benefits from that silence, you begin to see a completely different map of how the world became what it is. You begin to understand why certain populations feel a groundless shame about their own past that they cannot quite locate the origin of. Why certain conflicts seem to have causes that the official narrative cannot quite explain. Why certain questions feel somehow prohibited not by law, but by the social weight of having been trained, very carefully, not to ask them. What survived is the final piece of the argument. Because they never get it all. The Dead Sea Scrolls stayed hidden in clay jars in caves above Qumran for approximately 1,900 years, placed there by people fleeing Roman destruction in 68 AD, and a Bedouin shepherd found them in 1947. The Nag Hammadi Library, Gnostic Christian texts describing an early Christianity that looked nothing like the institutionalized church, texts that had been systematically excluded from the official canon, buried in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert, discovered in 1945. The oral traditions of indigenous peoples across every continent, carried in the bodies and memories of grandmothers and elders through every colonial policy designed to destroy them, still alive, still being spoken, still encoding knowledge that was never written down precisely because the people who held it understood that what is written can be burned. The 4 Maya codices hold fragments of an astronomical system so accurate that modern calculations confirm it. The stone architecture of pre-colonial civilizations encodes knowledge in geometry that the burning could not reach. Truth is more persistent than power expects, because power thinks institutionally, in libraries and schools and official records, and truth travels in human beings. In the ones who memorize. In the ones who copy manuscripts by candlelight. In the ones who, when the library burns, run into the smoke and carry out what they can hold. You are still standing in that burning library. And you understand now what you didn't at the beginning, that the men feeding the fire are not simply evil. They are afraid. They are afraid of what happens to their version of the world when another version of the world becomes available. Every empire, every ideological system, every institution that has ever consolidated power has arrived at the same conclusion: the past must be managed. The future must be shaped by controlling what the present is allowed to remember. And what they consistently underestimate, what history itself seems to insist on, across every century and every civilization, is the persistence of the thing they tried to kill. The clay jars in the caves. The grandmothers who remember. The smudge of carbon at the edge of a burned page that still holds the ghost of a letter. The questions that refuse to stop being asked no matter how thoroughly the answers have been removed. History belongs to the ones who refuse to accept the version they were handed. And the most radical thing you can do, in any era, under any system, in any country, is to keep asking what was there before they told you there was nothing.